The void between stars was never truly empty. Commander Zapkel of the Zapirian Third Fleet knew this better than most. His crystalline command throne pulsed with soft blue-green light as he studied the tactical hologram floating before him, a web of glowing teal vectors and shimmering threat markers. The enemy armada, a swarm of jagged black silhouettes against the starfield, had already consumed 3 border systems. Now they advanced toward the last Zapirian stronghold in this sector. His secondary limbs twitched in agitation, the translucent membranes between his joints flickering with stress. The reports from the front lines were dire. Their living crystal warships, once thought invincible, shattered under the relentless assault. Their bioluminescent energy cores designed to regenerate were being drained faster than they could heal. Quilex, his chief scientist, stood beside him, her silver carapaced fingers dancing across the holographic interface. "The calculations are unchanged, Commander," she murmured, her voice like wind through crystal chimes. "Even with full mobilization, our fleet cannot hold." Zapkel's primary eyes narrowed. He had seen the projections 100 times. The numbers did not lie. The Zapirian Dominion, once the jewel of the galactic arm, would fall within the cycle. And then, like a whisper from the void itself, the old transmissions resurfaced. The bridge crew froze as the comm array crackled to life, spitting out a burst of archaic signals. The language was crude, the encryption laughably primitive by modern standards. But the content, Zapkel's breath stilled. It was a distress call, not theirs. A human one. Decades old, the bridge screens flickered, resolving into grainy footage. A single Terran fighter, its angular hull scorched and venting atmosphere, spinning helplessly in the grip of a dying star. The Zapirian cruiser Luminous Tide had intercepted the signal, diverted course, and against all protocol, extracted the pilot before the star's gravity well claimed him. A meaningless act of mercy, at least. That was what the High Council had called it. Zapkel remembered the debates, the arguments, the dismissals. Why waste resources on a species that barely understands fusion? Let them burn themselves out in their petty wars. The footage shifted. The rescued human, Captain Rodney Emigan. The records identified him, standing before the Zapirian delegation, his dark eyes burning with something they could not name. He had bowed, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Then he spoke a single phrase, translated roughly by their linguists. Earth remembers. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, as the enemy fleet closed in, as the last of their crystalline dreadnoughts prepared for a final, hopeless stand, the comm array screamed to life, not with static, not with pleas, but with coordinates. Hundreds of them, flooding in from the outer dark. Quilex's voice trembled. "Commander, those vectors, they're converging." Zapkel stared at the hologram, watching as new signatures blinked into existence, one after another, not Zapirian, and at the heart of the storm, a single vessel, its designation burning crimson in the tactical feed, indomitable. The legend of the Ghost Fleet had just answered its call. Section Fe. Echoes in the dark, the bridge of the celestial tier hummed with the low, mournful pulse of dying systems. Zapkel's claws flexed against the crystalline command console, the bioluminescent panels beneath his fingers flickering like fading stars. The holographic tactical display painted the void in cold blues and greens. The enemy fleet, a swarm of crimson sigils closing like jaws around their last stronghold. The words slithered through his mind, venomous and undeniable. Quilex stood rigid beside him, his antennae twitching in erratic patterns, the bioluminescent veins beneath his chitinous skin pulsing with distress. His voice, when it came, was a whisper of fractured harmonics. "Commander, those vectors, they're converging." Zapkel's secondary eyelids flicked sideways, a reflexive blink against the impossible. The hologram shimmered, recalibrating as new signatures bled into existence. Hundreds of them, erupting from the dark like silent comets. Not the jagged, predatory shapes of the enemy, not the elegant, crystalline curves of Zapirian design. The signatures burned gold in the display, their trajectories knitting together into a net of fire and steel. And at the center, indomitable, the name alone was a blade between his ribs. Memory surfaced, unbidden. Decades passed. A single human life, pulled from the wreckage of a primitive vessel, its occupant half, dead from radiation burns. A curiosity, nothing more. The Zapirian High Council had debated dissecting the specimen, studying its crude biology. But Zapkel had intervened, a pointless mercy. A flicker of sentimentality in a universe that rewarded none. The human had bowed, not in submission. In acknowledgement, Earth remembers. At the time, the words had been empty, a ritual perhaps, a superstition. Now, the void itself answered. The indomitable was a scar across the stars, a monstrous silhouette that defied the elegant geometry of Zapirian engineering. Its hull was a patchwork of brutal angles and scorched armor, studded with weapon emplacements that glowed like the eyes of a waking beast. Railgun batteries the size of frigates, plasma lances coiled like serpents along its flanks, and beneath it all, the deep resonant thrum of engines that didn't purr, they growled. Quilex's mandibles clicked in disbelief. This is a warship. Zapkel's throat tightened. No, this was something older, something hungrier. The comm array crackled, not with the sterile precision of Zapirian frequencies, but with the raw, unfiltered burst of human transmission. A voice, rough with static, and something darker. Zapirian Command, this is Colonel Amanda Kim, of the Terran Defense Fleet. You are not alone. Silence, then. 100 more channels roared to life. The ghost fleet had come, and it was laughing. The indomitable hung in the void, like a predator baring its teeth, its jagged silhouette, a blasphemy against the luminous curves of Zapirian architecture. The crystalline spires of their command nexus pulsed with alarm, their soft blue-green glow flickering under the shadow of the human warship. Zapkel's claws flexed against the smooth bioluminescent panel of his command console. He had studied the Terrans, their wars, their reckless expansion, their stubborn refusal to die. But this was something else. The Indomitable wasn't just a ship, it was a promise. A promise written in scorched armor and the cold, unblinking gaze of its railgun batteries. A promise that said, "We remember." Quilex's antennae twitched, his crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the eerie glow of the human vessel's engines. Their power signatures, they don't match any known Terran design. This isn't standard fleet issue. Zapkel exhaled slowly. Of course it wasn't. The Terrans had always been scavengers, survivors, stitching together victory from the wreckage of defeat. But this ship, this was something they had built for a purpose. And then the transmission came, not through the clean, harmonic frequencies of Zapirian comms, but through a burst of raw, unfiltered noise, like a voice screaming through static and blood. Zapirian Command. This is Colonel Amanda Kim of the Terran Defense Fleet. A pause, the kind that settled into bones. You are not alone. The words hung in the air, heavy with something Zapkel couldn't place. Not until the sensors flared to life. 100 more signatures blinked into existence. The Indomitable was not alone. It never had been. The Terran fleet emerged from the dark like specters, their hulls bearing the scars of battles the Zapirians had never seen. Some were sleek, predatory things, their armor blackened by weapons fire. Others were hulking monstrosities, their frames welded together from salvaged wrecks in defiance. And then there were the smaller ships, swift, jagged, their engines burning with the same reckless fury as the pilots who flew them. Quilex's mandibles parted in disbelief. They hid them all this time. Zapkel's crest of spines flattened against his skull, because he understood now the Terrans had never been absent. They had been waiting. And now, as the enemy armada bore down on the last Zapirian stronghold, the humans had answered, a call no one remembered sending. The Indomitable's engines flared, its weapons humming to life. The ghost fleet had come, and it was laughing. The Zapirian command nexus thrummed with panic, its crystalline walls flickering under the weight of incoming data streams. Zapkel's claws flexed against the holographic display, the projections warping around his grip. The enemy armada filled the tactical readout, a swarm of angular predatory ships, their formations tightening like a noose around the last Zapirian stronghold. And then, cutting through the tide of hostile signatures, the Terran fleet. Not just the indomitable dozens of them, Quilex's bio, luminescent veins, pulsed erratically as he parsed the sensor logs. They were cloaked, he murmured, his voice thin with disbelief. Not just stealth, active masking. Their signatures were folded into background radiation, solar flares, even our own sensor echoes. Zapkel's secondary eyelids flicked shut for a moment, a reflexive gesture of dread. The Terrans hadn't just been hiding. They had been woven into the void itself, watching, waiting while the galaxy forgot they existed. A memory surfaced, decades old, half dismissed as myth. A single human life, pulled from a wreckage field during the Third Expansion War. A Zapirian salvage crew had found the drifting escape pod, its occupant barely alive. They had taken him aboard, treated his wounds, asked nothing in return. When he had recovered, he had bowed, a strange, archaic gesture, and vanished into the dark. No demands, no debts. Zapkel had assumed the story was apocryphal. Now, staring at the Terran fleet materializing like vengeful wraiths, he wondered. The Indomitable's comm channel crackled to life. No preamble, no declaration. Just a voice, female, calm, edged with something that wasn't quite amusement. Zapirian Command. This is Colonel Amanda Kim of the Terran Defense Initiative. You're a little outnumbered. Suggest you fall back behind our line. Quilex's mandibles twitched. They can't possibly think. The tactical display updated. The Terran ships weren't just there. They were moving. Not in formation, not with the rigid precision of the galactic powers. They lunged, frigates spiraled into attack vectors that defied inertia, their thrusters burning white. Hot cruisers slid between Zapirian defensive grids as if they had always belonged there. And the fighters, Quilex's breath caught. The fighters moved like living things, not machines, not drones. They danced, weaving through the enemy's point. Defense fire as if it were nothing more than wind. Zapkel's spines flattened because he recognized this. Not tactics, not strategy. The Terrans weren't fighting a battle, they were hunting. And somewhere in the chaos, a single thought crystallized. We saved one of them. And they remembered. The void between stars had never felt so alive. Quilex watched the tactical display with mounting disbelief as the Terran fleet carved through the enemy lines like a blade through water. Their movements were fluid, unpredictable, each ship reacting not to orders, but to the shifting tides of battle itself. The Zapirian command deck was silent, the usual hum of crystalline processors drowned out by the sheer presence of the human armada. They had expected reinforcements. They had not expected this. The Terran vessels bore no markings of the great galactic powers, no standardized hulls, no uniform weapon configurations. Each ship was a relic of 100 different wars, refitted and reforged into something new. Some were sleek, their armor blackened by atmospheric re-entry burns, their railgun arrays humming with barely contained energy. Others were jagged, their silhouettes broken by salvaged plating, their engines belching raw plasma as they pushed past safety limits. And then there were the fighters. Quilex's mandibles twitched as he tracked their trajectories. They moved in packs, darting between the lumbering enemy dreadnoughts, like wolves circling prey. Their thrusters flared in erratic bursts, their pilots pulling maneuvers that should have liquefied their organs. Yet they flew as if gravity were a suggestion, not a law. Zapkel's spines rippled in unease. This wasn't just skill. It was memory, centuries of war, of survival, etched into the reflexes of every Terran at the helm. They didn't just fight. They remembered every battle their ancestors had ever lost. And they had learned. A flicker on the scanners. One of the enemy carriers, its shields, buckling under sustained railgun fire, attempted to disengage. The Terran response was immediate. A single frigate, its hull pockmarked, with old scars, broke formation. Its engines flared crimson as it lunged, cutting off the carrier's retreat. For a moment, Quilex thought it would ram. Then the frigate's ventral bays opened. Boarding pods, not the sleek, precision, crafted assault capsules of the galactic powers. These were crude things, armored shells with jury, rigged thrusters, their hatches welded shut from the outside. They weren't meant to open from within. The pods slammed into the carrier's hull, their magnetic clamps biting deep. Seconds later, the first explosions tore through the enemy ship's interior. Zapkel's claws tightened around the command console. The Terrans hadn't just boarded. They had burned their way in, and now they were loose inside. Quilex exhaled slowly, his bioluminescent markings dimming in something akin to awe. The Zapirians had saved a single human life long ago. And in return, humanity had sent an entire fleet. Not out of obligation, not out of strategy, but because that was what they did. Somewhere in the chaos, a transmission crackled over the comms. Colonel Amanda Kim's voice, calm amid the storm. "Zapkel, you're clear to advance." For the first time in cycles, the Zapirian commander felt something unfamiliar. The battle raged in silence. Not the silence of absence. No, the void was alive, with the shriek of rending metal, the thunder of railgun salvos, the static hiss of dying shields. But to Zapkel, standing motionless on the bridge of his crippled flagship, it all felt distant. Muted, his compound eyes flickered across the tactical display, watching the Terran assault unfold in jagged vectors of crimson and gold. The human boarding pods had done their work. Half the enemy carrier's internal systems were already dark, its crystalline power cores flickering erratically as fires spread through its organic circuitry. Something was wrong. Quilex sensed it first. The scientist's antennae twitched, his bioluminescent markings pulsing a warning blue. "Commander," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of failing systems. "The enemy fleet, they're not retreating." Zapkel's claws flexed. He saw it now. The remaining enemy vessels weren't falling back to regroup. They weren't even maneuvering to defend their stricken carrier. They were holding position. A cold ripple passed through the bridge. The Zapirians were a species of logic, of crystalline precision. But even they recognized the shape of a trap. Then the broadcast hit. It came from nowhere. Every comm channel, every sensor array, even the emergency frequencies, all of them flooded with the same signal, raw and unfiltered. At first, it was just noise, a jagged screech of interference. Then slowly, it resolved into something worse. But not Colonel Kim's. This voice was older, rougher, laced with something that made Zapkel's exoskeleton prickle. "Attention Zapirian forces." The words were in perfect galactic standard, but the cadence was unmistakably Terran, each syllable weighted with the kind of quiet intensity that preceded violence. "This is Captain Rodney Emigan, Faith Voidborn Division. We've intercepted enemy comms. They've rigged their carrier's core to detonate." Quilex frills flared. "A suicide charge." Zapkel didn't answer. His gaze locked onto the tactical display, where the enemy carrier's energy signature was spiking wildly. The humans had seen it too. Their ships were already peeling away, their thrusters flaring as they scrambled to put distance between themselves and the doomed vessel. But the Zapirian fleet, battered, half disabled, couldn't move fast enough. The voice continued, calm as a blade being drawn. "You've got 90 seconds. We're sending coordinates for an emergency jump. It's not pretty, but IT'll get you clear." A data packet followed, flooding their nav systems with a chaotic stream of calculations, improvised slipspace vectors, cobbled together from half-dead Terran navigation AIs and whatever sensor data they'd scraped from the battlefield. Quilek's mandibles clicked in disbelief. These trajectories, they're insane. The margin for error is non-existent. Imogen finished, as if head heard. But it's that or eat a plasma storm, your call. For a heartbeat, the bridge was utterly still. Then Zapkel moved. His claws danced across the console, inputting the jump sequence with a speed that bordered on desperation. Around him, his crew followed suit, their movements sharp, with something no Zapirian had ever been trained to feel. The countdown hit 0, space twisted. The last thing Zapkel saw before the jump tore reality apart was the enemy carrier, its crystalline hull splitting open like a dying star, vomiting blue-green fire into the void, and the Terran fleet still turning back toward the blast. Coming for them, reality snapped back into place with a shudder that ran through the Calavan's crystalline bones. The ship groaned, its bioluminescent veins flickering erratically as the slipspace jump dumped them into the void like a corpse spat from a dying star. Zapkel's claws dug into the command console, his carapace still vibrating with the aftershocks of the jump. The bridge was bathed in emergency lighting, deep pulsing crimson bleeding through the translucent panels, casting jagged shadows across the crew's exoskeletons. His secondary eyes flicked to the tactical display. They were alive. The Calavan listed to port, its starboard energy conduits ruptured, leaking arcs of blue-green plasma like blood from a wound. Half the ship's systems were dark, their organic circuitry burned out by the strain of the jump. The enemy carrier was gone, vanished into the firestorm dead left behind. Quilek's voice was a rasp, his mandibles trembling. The Terran vectors, they worked. He sounded like he didn't believe it, like the numbers had lied to him. Zapkel didn't answer. His primary eyes were locked on the rear display, where the Terran fleet should have been, where there was now only an expanding sphere of blue, white annihilation, swallowing the battlefield whole. His thorax tightened, dead turned back. A chime cut through the silence. The comms officer stiffened, his antennae twitching. High Commander, we're being hailed. Zapkel didn't need to ask by whom. The screen flickered to life, and Colonel Amanda Kim's face filled it, streaked with sweat. Her dark hair plastered to her forehead, her eyes burning with something that made Zapkel's carapace prickle. She was smiling. "Glad you made it," she said, as if they hadn't just torn a hole in the universe to escape. "Because we've got a problem." Behind her, the bridge of her ship was chaos, smoke curling from shattered consoles, crew shouting over the din of alarms. And beyond the viewport, Zapkel's breath caught. A Zapirian dreadnought, or what was left of one. Its crystalline hull was shattered, great jagged fissures running through its structure, blue-green energy bleeding into the void. But it wasn't dead, it was moving. Kim's grin sharpened. "Turns out your people weren't the only ones who got ambushed today." The dreadnought's remaining weapons flared to life. Zapkel's claws flexed. The Calavan was crippled. The Terran fleet was scattered, half their ships still burning from the slipspace backlash. And the enemy wasn't done. Kim leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried like a blade. "You still owe me a drink, Zapkel." The screen went dark, and the Calavan's sensors screamed as the dreadnought opened fire. The Calavan shuddered as the dying dreadnought's weapons carved through the void, its fractured crystalline hull pulsing with erratic blue-green energy. Zapkel's claws dug into the command console, the bioluminescent interface flickering under his grip. He had seen human wars before, from the safety of observation posts and intelligence briefings, where the Terrans had been nothing more than a footnote. A young, reckless species, too fractured to be a true threat. This was different. The dreadnought salvos weren't the precise, calculated strikes of a Zapirian warship. They were feral, desperate, the kind of fire that came from a crew who knew they were already dead and had decided to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. And the Terran Zapkel's secondary eyelids flicked shut for a fraction of a second, shielding his vision from the glare of another explosion. The human fleet, scattered and burning, was regrouping, not fleeing, not surrendering. Kim's voice echoed in his mind. You still owe me a drink. A joke. Zapkel had studied human psychology. He knew the significance of debts in their culture. But he had never understood, not truly, until now. Because the Terrans weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for him, for a debt decades old, for a single life saved when they had been weak. And now, with their own ships crippled, their own crews dying, they were throwing themselves between the Calavan and the enemy. A Zapirian would have called it madness. A human would have called it honor. Quilex's voice crackled over the comms. The scientists' usually measured tones frayed with disbelief. They're not retreating. Their engines are damaged, their shields failing, and they're still moving into the line of fire. Zapkel didn't answer. He didn't need to, because on the tactical display, the Terran ships were doing something no Zapirian commander would have ever dared. They were charging, not in formation, not with precision, but like a storm. Like wolves, the dreadnought's weapons flared again, and for a heartbeat, Zapkel thought he saw the silhouette of a human vessel. Kim's vessel, twist through the barrage, her hull scorched, her engines sputtering, and still she fired. Still she laughed. The Zapirian High Command had dismissed humanity as too emotional, too reckless, too small to matter. But they had missed the war, the one that mattered, the one where the Terrans fought not for territory, not for resources, but for something the galaxy had long forgotten, for each other. And now, as the Calavan sensors screamed with incoming fire, Zapkel understood. This wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning, and humanity had come to collect. Section Faye. The call to Earth, the Calavan's bridge, pulsed with blue-green emergency lighting, the crystalline panels flickering as the dreadnought's shields buckled under the Terran assault. Zapkel's talons dug into the command console, his carapace rigid with something between awe and terror. He had seen war, he had seen defeat. But this was something else. The human ships moved like living things, their trajectories chaotic, their strikes brutal. No Zapirian fleet would have dared such maneuvers. No sane species would. Every textbook, every tactical doctrine screamed that this was suicide, yet the Terrans thrived in it. On the tactical display, the indomitable Kim's ship was a bleeding beast. Her hull pockmarked with plasma burns, her starboard thrusters spitting fire. But she didn't slow, she didn't stop. She carved through the Zapirian flank like a blade through water, her railguns roaring, her point defense turrets swatting aside torpedoes with contemptuous ease. A transmission, not from the Indomitable, from Earth. The signal cut through the interference like a scalpel, crisp and clear, and the bridge fell silent as the holographic display resolved into the face of a human, older, weathered, her eyes sharp as flint. Zapkel of the Calavan. Her voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that came before annihilation. Zapkel's spines flattened. He knew that tone. He had heard it once before, decades ago. When his people had pulled a single human child from the wreckage of a crashed shuttle, her parents dead, her world unknown, they had asked for nothing in return. You saved one of ours, the woman said. Now we save you. The tactical display erupted. New signatures, hundreds of them, bloomed into existence at the system's edge, their drives burning white, hot as they tore into real space. Not just warships, dreadnoughts the size of small moons, their armor blackened by centuries of war, carriers disgorging wings of fighters in perfect murderous sync, and at their heart, a vessel that made the Calavan look like a lifeboat. The Titan's wrath, Zapkel's breath caught. The Zapirian High Command had dismissed humanity as primitive, but they had never seen Earth's true fleet. The one they kept hidden, the one they only unleashed when the debt came due. And as the first wave of Terran railgun fire split the void, Zapkel realized this wasn't a rescue, it was a lesson, and the galaxy would remember. The void shuddered. Zapkel's crystalline command throne vibrated beneath him, As the first salvo of Terran munitions carved through the darkness, railgun rounds, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, struck the enemy vanguard with surgical precision. Shields flared, blue-green Zapirian barriers, designed to diffuse energy weapons, then shattered under kinetic force alone. The impacts were not explosions, but erasures. Entire sections of enemy hulls simply ceased to exist, atomized by tungsten spears, moving too fast for matter to resist. Quilek's frill spines flattened against his skull, his bioluminescent markings flickering in distress. His talons hovered over the sensor array, the data streams a chaotic blur. Impossible, human vessels were not supposed to move like this, not with this terrifying synchronicity, not with engines that burned cold, leaving no ion trails to track. Their formations were fractal, unpredictable, yet every maneuver locked the enemy fleet into a killing box. And then there was the sound. Zapirian comms were silent, efficient. But the humans, their channels howled, not with orders, not with discipline, with voices, 1,000 pilots, gunners, engineers, roaring in unison, not in fear, but in recognition. The same voices that had once screamed defiance in the mud of ancient battlefields now echoed across the void, and the weight of history pressed down on Zapkel's thorax like a dying star. Colonel Amanda Kim stood at the heart of it all, her image flickering across the Calavan's holodisplay. She was not smiling. She was waiting. The enemy fleet, so confident, so vast, recoiled. Their formations, once immaculate, now wavered as their commanders realized the truth. They had not ambushed a dying race. They had awakened one. Captain Rodney Emigan's fighter streaked past the Calavan's viewports, his craft a sleek, angular predator amidst the crystalline elegance of Zapirian ships. His wingman, designation, Revenant, rolled inverted, guns blazing, and a line of enemy interceptors detonated in sequence, fireballs blooming like poisoned flowers. Zapkel's mandibles parted. This was not war as the galaxy understood it. This was vengeance, and humanity had been perfecting it for millennia. The Titan's wrath loomed closer, its shadow swallowing stars. And the lesson began. The void between stars had never felt so alive. Zapkel's crystalline command throne pulsed with warning sigils, their blue-green luminescence staining the air like drowned fire. His compound eyes flickered across the tactical display, absorbing the impossible. Human ships, Terran ships, moved like liquid fury, where the Zapirian fleet flowed in elegant geometric formations. The human vessels lunged. Their thrusters burned white, hot vectors shifting with a violence that defied physics. The Titan's wrath, a behemoth of blackened alloy and scorched armor plates, carved through the enemy vanguard like a blade through flesh. Its flanks bristled with weapon ports, each one vomiting fire. Not the clean, precise beams of galactic standard arms, but brutality given form. Hypervelocity slugs that shattered crystalline hulls, plasma streams that boiled away entire decks, missiles that unmade their targets in spheres of artificial supernovae. And the fighters, Zapkel's antennae, trembled as he tracked Captain Emigan's craft. The human pilot wove through the chaos as if death were an afterthought, his fighter's engines screaming in the vacuum. A trio of enemy interceptors broke formation to pursue him, their sleek, organic curves glinting with predatory grace. Emigan let them come. At the last possible moment, he killed his thrust, flipped end over end, and unleashed a storm of tungsten slugs. The lead interceptor disintegrated. The second, swerving wildly, collided with the third in a blossom of blue fire and shattered chitin. Zapkel's thorax tightened. This was not the work of machines. This was the work of predators. Quilek stood frozen at the science console, her delicate manipulator limbs hovering over the holographic readouts. The data streams were wrong. Human neural patterns flickered across her screens. Brainwaves synced to their ship systems. Reaction times measured in microseconds. The Terran pilots weren't just controlling their vessels. They were merging with them, a whisper of memory surfaced in Quilek's mind. An old, half-forgotten report from the first contact decades past. A human adage scrawled in the margins of a recovered flight manual. The machine is your body, the sky is your blood. She had dismissed it as poetic nonsense. Now, watching Emigan's fighter dance through the storm of enemy fire, she understood. Colonel Kim's voice crackled across the caravans, calm stripped of all ornamentation. Zapkel, their command ship's shields are failing. The alien commander turned his gaze to the heart of the enemy fleet. The massive crystalline dreadnought, its surface alive with pulsing veins of blue energy, shuddered under the Titan's Wrath's assault. Cracks spider-webbed across its hull, leaking luminous ichor into the void. Zapkel felt no triumph, only the weight of history. This was the ship that had burned his homeworld. This was the ship that had slaughtered billions, and now it bled. Emigan's fighter streaked past the dreadnought's flank, guns silent. For one impossible moment, Zapkel thought the human had disengaged. Then he saw the payload, a single torpedo, sleek and black, detached from Emigan's undercarriage and spiraled toward the dreadnought's cracked hull. It moved slowly, as if savoring the approach. The detonation was not fire, not light, it was absence. A sphere of perfect black swallowed the dreadnought's midsection, collapsing its structure inward like crumpled paper. The remaining halves twisted apart, spewing molten crystal and dying crew into the dark. Silence gripped the caravan's bridge. Then, from the depths of the comms channel, Kim spoke again, soft final. Now they remember. The enemy fleet recoiled. Their formations dissolved into panic, ships scrambling to flee the storm they had unleashed. Zapkel exhaled, his carapace humming with something he had not felt in decades. The void between stars had never felt so alive. Zapkel watched as the remnants of the enemy fleet scattered, their crystalline warships flickering like dying embers in the dark. The dreadnought's destruction had carved a wound in their resolve, a wound that bled hesitation, then terror. Yet, even as the tide turned, something gnawed at him. The Zapirian commander turned his faceted eyes toward the human fleet, their ships battered but unbroken. Their hulls were scarred, their formations ragged, but they held. And among them, the fighter wings, those tiny, reckless vessels, still danced through the wreckage, hunting stragglers with predatory grace. One fighter in particular caught his attention. Emigan's craft hung motionless for a moment, its thrusters dimmed. The torpedo that had shattered the dreadnought had been a weapon of last resort, a relic from an older war. The human pilot had carried it for years, waiting. Zapkel's neural tendrils pulsed with an unfamiliar warmth. Then, the comms crackled. Quilek's voice, usually measured, was raw with urgency. "Commander, the caravan's core is destabilizing. The last hit ruptured the containment lattice. We have minutes." The words should have been a death knell. The caravan was the last of the great Zapirian battlecruisers, its crystalline heart woven with centuries of knowledge, of history. To lose it now, after surviving the impossible, but before Zapkel could speak, another voice cut through the static. Colonel Kim to caravan. The human commander's tone was calm, deliberate. "We're sending a repair team. Stand by." Zapkel's mandibles twitched. Repair team. The damage was catastrophic. The core's energy signatures were already spiraling into the red, its containment field fraying at the edges. Even the Zapirian's own engineers had no solution. A human dropship detached from the Titan's Wrath, flanked by a trio of fighters. It moved with purpose, cutting through the debris field toward the dying caravan. Quilek's bioluminescent patterns flickered in disbelief. "They can't possibly." Zapkel silenced him with a gesture. Because he had seen this before, decades ago, on a forgotten battle. His single human life had been spared by a Zapirian scout, a meaningless act of mercy in a war that had consumed billions. And now, against all reason, humanity remembered. The dropship docked. The humans moved with terrifying efficiency, their armored figures spilling into the Calavan's shattered corridors. They carried devices the Zapirians did not recognize, thrumming generators, liquid, metal sealants. Something that glowed like captured lightning. One figure lingered at the threshold of the bridge. Colonel Kim. Her visor was up, revealing a face lined with exhaustion and something else. Resolve, yes, but beneath it, something quieter. Recognition. Zapkel stepped forward, his carapace humming with residual energy. You should not risk yourselves for this. Kim's lips quirked. Yeah, well, we're real bad at leaving debts unpaid. Then she turned, barking orders to her team, and the humans worked. The core's death rattle stuttered, then stilled. The containment field stabilized, its fractures sealed by human ingenuity and sheer stubbornness. The Calavan would live, and as the last of the enemy ships vanished into the dark, Zapkel understood. This was not just a battle won. It was a promise kept. The Calavan hung in the void, its crystalline spires flickering with the ghostly afterglow of battle. The human repair teams moved through its wounded halls like surgeons, their tools stitching together the gashes in the ship's bioluminescent veins. Zapkel watched them from the bridge, his mandibles twitching in silent disbelief. They should not have come. That was the thought that coiled in his mind, cold and unshakable. The Zapirian High Command had long dismissed humanity as a fractured species, too young, too reckless, too bound by their chaotic emotions. And yet, here they were, salvaging a ship that even the most advanced races in the Union would have abandoned. Quilex approached, his antennae vibrating with residual static from the near-core breach. The containment matrix is holding, he murmured, his voice a whisper of chitinous clicks. They're engineers. They recalibrated our harmonics in minutes. Zapkel did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the viewport, where the human vessels, jagged, angular things, their hulls scarred from 100 battles, drifted in formation. They were not beautiful, not like the sleek arcs of Zapirian architecture, but there was something in their asymmetry, in the way their engines pulsed like the heartbeat of something alive, that unsettled him. A debt repaid. That was what Kim had said. But this was more than repayment. This was defiance. Colonel Kim stood in the Calavan's med bay, her gloves smeared with coolant and something darker. Blood may be hers, maybe not. The Zapirian wounded lay in their regeneration pods, their injuries sealed by human field dressings. One of them, a young scout, reached out with a trembling limb. Kim hesitated, then clasped it. The scout's bioluminescence flickered, gratitude, or perhaps something deeper. Captain Imagan appeared at her side, his visor cracked, his voice rough. Command's hailing us. They want to know if we're pulling back. Kim exhaled. The Calavan was stable, but the war wasn't over. The enemy fleet had retreated, but they would return, and Earth had just drawn a line in the stars. Tell them, she said, we're not done yet. Zapkel found her on the observation deck, staring at the distant glimmer of Sol. Your people, he began, then faltered. The words felt inadequate. You did not have to do this. Kim didn't turn. Yeah, we did. Silence then. They'll come back, Zapkel said. Kim's smile was sharp. Good. Beyond the viewport, the human fleet ignited their drives. The stars trembled. Section. Faye. The reckoning, the Calavan hung in the void like a scarred sentinel, its hull still bleeding coolant from ruptured conduits. The battle had left its mark, not just on the ship, but on the Zapirians who now moved through its corridors with a reverence bordering on awe. Their crystalline limbs cast flickering blue-green reflections against the carbon, scored bulkheads, their bioluminescent patterns pulsing in slow, uncertain waves. Zapkel stood at the edge of the command deck, his carapace still humming with residual energy from the engagement. The humans had not just fought. They had unmade the enemy's strategy, tearing through formations with a brutality that bordered on artistry. And yet, For all their ferocity, they had not left the Zapirians behind. They had shielded them. That was the part he could not reconcile. Quilex approached, his sensory filaments twitching as he studied the tactical display. The remnants of the enemy fleet were regrouping at the system's edge, their signatures dim but persistent. "They are waiting," he murmured, assessing. They did not expect this. Zapkel's mandibles flexed. Of course they hadn't. The galactic consensus had dismissed humanity as reckless, emotional, a species too fractured to wield true power. But the Terrans had not fractured today. They had unified, and now the enemy knew fear. Colonel Kim stood in the Calavan's armory, her fingers tracing the scorch marks along the barrel of her rail rifle. Around her, human and Zapirian engineers worked in tandem, the latter adapting with startling speed to the humans' jury-rigged systems. One of them, a young technician with opalescent plating, hesitated before a rack of plasma grenades, then carefully mimicked the loading sequence she'd seen Emigan use. Kim didn't stop her. Emigan himself leaned against a support strut, his armor half disassembled, his knuckles split and smeared with dried blood. "They learn fast," he observed. Kim nodded. They had to. The Zapirians had been hunted to the brink. Survival had sharpened them. A chime echoed through the ship. An alert. The enemy was moving. Kim exhaled, long and slow. Time to finish this. The Zapirian fleet was a ghost of what it had once been. Shattered crystalline hulls, flickering energy cores, ships held together by little more than willpower. But they formed up alongside the human vessels without hesitation, their remaining fighters falling into escort positions. Zapkel watched the tactical feed as the enemy advanced, their formation tightening like a noose. Then the human fleet moved, not as individual ships, but as a single entity, a predator uncoiling. Railgun batteries fired in staggered volleys, their hypersonic rounds punching through shields before the enemy could recalibrate. Plasma lances carved glowing wounds across the void. And then, the Calavan's new weapon activated. A pulse of distorted gravity rippled outward, a shock wave that bent space itself. Enemy vessels shuddered, their drives stuttering, their trajectories unraveling. For a single frozen moment, the battlefield held its breath. Then the human fighters struck. Zapkel's carapace vibrated with the sheer, terrifying precision of it. This was not the desperate brawl of their first engagement. This was annihilation, methodical and absolute. Quilex voice was barely audible over the comms. "They are not just fighting, they are making a statement." And the galaxy would hear it. When the last enemy ship fractured under the Calavan's guns, the silence was deafening. Kim stood on the bridge, her hands loose at her sides. The Zapirians around her were utterly still, their bioluminescence flaring in erratic bursts. Disbelief, awe, something deeper. Zapkel approached. This time, he did not hesitate. "You could have left," he said. Kim turned, her eyes reflecting the distant stars. "No," she said softly. "We couldn't." Beyond the viewport, the wreckage of the enemy fleet drifted, a graveyard of arrogance, and humanity's debt was paid. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of centuries. Zapkel's mandibles twitched, his bioluminescent veins pulsing in erratic waves of blue-green. Disbelief, reverence, something that had no name in his language. The bridge of the Calavan hummed with residual energy, the crystalline panels flickering as if struggling to process what had just unfolded. Around him, his crew stood frozen, their carapaces rigid, their antennae trembling. They had all heard the stories. The ancient Zapirian texts spoke of a single act of mercy, a dying human vessel, adrift in the void, its crew suffocating in the dark. A Zapirian scout ship, bound by no law but its own conscience, had pulled one survivor from the wreckage. A child, they had asked for nothing in return. And now, centuries later, as the last echoes of battle faded, Zapkel understood the humans had not come because they owed a debt. They had come because they remembered. Colonel Amanda Kim stood before the viewport, her silhouette framed by the wreckage of the enemy fleet. The starlight caught the edges of her uniform, the scars on her knuckles, the quiet intensity in her eyes. She did not gloat, she did not celebrate, she simply watched, as if ensuring the silence held. Zapkel stepped forward, the crystalline floor resonating beneath his claws. "You could have left," he repeated, the words heavier this time. Kim turned, and for the first time, he saw the exhaustion beneath her composure, the weight of command of history, of a species that had clawed its way from the dirt of its homeworld to stand here, in the ruins of a battle they had no reason to fight. "No," she said softly, "we couldn't." A shudder passed through the bridge. Quilex, the scientist, let out a low harmonic hum, a sound of revelation. The humans had not come for glory, or conquest, or even gratitude. They had come because once, long ago, someone had shown them kindness, and humanity never forgot. Beyond the viewport, the wreckage drifted twisted metal, shattered hulls, the remnants of an enemy who had believed themselves invincible. The Zapirian fleet, battered but intact, floated beside the human vessels, their crystalline forms glowing faintly in the dark. Zapkel exhaled, his carapace settling. The legends were real, and the galaxy would never be the same.